Good morning and welcome everyone to this webinar, Australia and Japan, Old Friends, New Opportunities, Decarbonising the Region with Hydrogen and Ammonia. So today's breakfast event or virtual breakfast is hosted by the Australian Hydrogen Council and the Ammonia Energy Association Australia, with the support from the Australia-Japan Business Cooperation Committee on the occasion of the AJBCC's 58th Annual Australia-Japan Joint Business Conference. So I'm Fiona Simon, CEO of the Australian Hydrogen Council, and my co-host is Andrew Dickson from the Ammonia Energy Association Australia and CWP Global. And joining us today are Dr. Alan Finkel, Special Advisor to the Australian Government on Low Emissions Technology, Shigeru Muraki from Tokyo Gas and the Clean Fuel Ammonia Association, Felicity Underhill from Fortescue Future Industries, and Alana Barlow from Sumitomo Australia. I'd like to acknowledge the presence here today also of the Australian Ambassador to Japan, Her Excellency Jan Adams, and the President of the AJBCC, Sir Rod Eddington. Welcome. So we'll be hearing from each of our speakers separately for around 10 minutes each, and then our speakers will come together for a panel discussion on a low emissions future with clean and green hydrogen and ammonia, and we'll have a look at what some of the roadblocks are that we need to work through. Before we start, please do enter questions for speakers in the Q&A box. And we also encourage the speakers to, wherever possible, answer in the written form. We'll also use the best questions to shape our panel discussion. So please do also put any logistical and technical questions in the chat box for Julian, who's doing our work behind the scenes from the Australian, so the Ammonia Energy Association to sort out. And just a note, this webinar will be recorded and made available to watch later today. You'll receive a link in your inbox to watch and share the recording later. So I'm going to briefly provide some opening remarks and let you know a little bit more about the Australian Hydrogen Council and developments in hydrogen. And Andrew is going to do the same thing from an ammonia perspective a little later in the session. So the Australian Hydrogen Council, or AHC, is the peak body for the emerging hydrogen industry, with our objective to grow the industry to have clean hydrogen as a key part of the energy mix. So we have 83 members at the moment, and our members are companies and spread across many sectors. The main areas are energy, transport, technology, and consulting. Really, our membership does cover the true versatility of hydrogen. So we know that the global interest and commitment to hydrogen is huge, and it's still growing. It's worth noting that internationally, there were two major sets of announcements made in August, where the US allocated $9.5 billion directly to hydrogen, with other multi-billion-dollar impacts from other infrastructure coverage to be likely. And the UK has also committed £240 million directly, with a further £1.3 billion for net zero with hydrogen as a priority. And yesterday, the IEA also released its update to its landmark report, The Future of Hydrogen. And the IEA notes that when it released its Future of Hydrogen report in 2019, only France, Japan, and Korea had strategies for the use of hydrogen. But today, there are 17 governments that have released hydrogen strategies, and more than 20 governments have publicly announced they're working to develop strategies. In Australia, our Renewable Energy Agency, ARENA, has announced its priorities, which of course include hydrogen. And this is going to shape over $1.6 billion worth of funding coming years. We've also seen the start of the Australian Federal Hubs funding program, with $464 million announced for the funding of 7 hydrogen hubs. And we're seeing great interest from industry, with around 74 projects around the country in various stages of development. And I do recommend, if you're interested in the projects and government policies, there's the website High Resource, which is HY Resource. That's hosted on our website for our government science agency, CSIRO, and it has all of the current announced projects across the full asset life cycle. And also there are periodic reports that are released that are very useful and provide a snapshot of the industry. And the political environment in Australia is changing too, as we approach COP26 and with the federal election looming. And increasingly, we're seeing a prospect of our government committing to net zero. So in this environment, the AHC released a white paper last week, and this sets out recommendations for actions to help achieve net zero with the assistance of the emerging hydrogen industry. And among other things, the white paper advocates for a net zero fund to be established with an initial allocation of $10 billion Australian and a top-up of $1 billion each year to 2030. And within this funding allocation, we recommend a hydrogen readiness program of at least $1 billion for industrial processes that can't readily be electrified. That's including for the production of iron and steel, for ammonia, for methanol and alumina and aluminium. And we're suggesting this because these are the applications that are more likely to require clean hydrogen to decarbonise and are more likely to achieve large scale. They can also open the market to other applications through knowledge and technology sharing, geographic proximity, and/or cost reductions. So looking at those early priorities, we used this diagram as an initial frame to describe how hydrogen can play a no regrets role in future decarbonisation. Now, this is from a great report from the Energy Transitions Commission. And the Commission plots various end uses for hydrogen by the confidence of having hydrogen having a key role to decarbonise and the readiness to use it. And we can see here that hydrogen uses toward the right along the x-axis reflect stronger confidence, and uses higher up the y-axis reflect greater readiness. And uses that rate well on both axes relate to where hydrogen already plays a role, such as the production of fertiliser. And here we see the value of ammonia for hydrogen. It's a huge market and it's one that already relies on hydrogen. Clean ammonia from clean hydrogen seems like an easy thing to value and to work toward. We see here that there's also a medium confidence for hydrogen in heavy trucking and high temperature heat processes with different degrees of readiness. And we can also see a high readiness for co-firing ammonia or hydrogen in power plants. Also shown here, we can see very heavy transport, such as shipping and aviation, are less ready, but also represent sectors where hydrogen will need to play a role. And again, and for shipping at least, this could be in the form of ammonia. So this is how we see the necessary outcomes. This is how the AHC sees the necessary outcomes for the industry, where we use the economic, regulatory and social licenses to operate as a way to frame the issues. Now, the economic license is where we need the industry to get to scale. It's not yet commercial, and the investment gap is more than the private sector will fill on its own. There's the regulatory license, where the industry needs stable, meaningful and efficient regulatory settings. Customers, communities, investors and our trading partners will all be looking for a degree of regulatory consistency and certainty. And then there's social license, which allows for trusted customer and community relationships. So we're looking at a significant energy and economic transition in the coming years and decades. And collectively, we need to establish engagement approaches, communications and information for a range of purposes. So for us, we're looking to get the policy settings in place to reduce these investment and knowledge gaps, to encourage the market and to really achieve and maintain these licenses to operate. This is just a little bit more about how we can get to those outcomes in the previous slide. So as we know, we will get there with local and international funding and investment, with strong and positive trading relationships, such as the one between Australia and Japan. There's a need for research and public communications to make sure that everyone is coming along for the journey. And then there's the need for laws, standards, regulations to provide that consistency that I mentioned before, as well as, of course, an industry that is able to comply with those regulatory requirements. And each of these aspects needs to account for different markets. There are various markets for hydrogen and different timeframes associated with that, and as seen in the slide from the Energy Transitions Commission. We also show here some of the important topics that live in the overlaps of those licenses to operate, such as the guarantee of origin, also known as hydrogen certification, which is about how the market for hydrogen can clearly value and certify the green credentials of the hydrogen that's being produced. And I expect that's something we'll hear more about today, and it's not specific to just hydrogen. So that concludes my opening remarks. And I'm so excited for us to hear from our speakers today. We're lucky to have a fantastic group of experts with us. First, I'd like to introduce Dr. Alan Finkel. In December 2020, Dr. Finkel was appointed by the Australian Prime Minister to serve as Special Advisor to the Australian Government on Low Emissions Technology. Dr. Finkel is the chair of the Technology Investment Advisory Council, and he's very busy on the international front, building relationships and partnerships to expand practical collaboration on Australia's priority low emissions technologies. Importantly, Dr. Finkel was our chief scientist in Australia from 2016 to 2020, and as chief scientist, and among many other things, he led the development of the 2019 National Hydrogen Strategy. So welcome, Dr. Finkel, and over to you.
Well, thank you so much, Fiona, and I'm going to share my screen. So just confirm for me, please, that you can see that. Anyway, I'll assume that you can. I look forward to hearing from our fellow panelists. That's Andrew and Felicity, Shigeru and Alana. And let me take you on a little bit of a quick overview of how I see the unfolding challenges for hydrogen and ammonia. Okay, if you look at greenhouse gas emissions across the Australian economy, you'll see that the vast majority of the emissions are in the energy sector. And the obvious conclusion is that the best return on effort is to focus that effort on using renewable energy for all of our needs. So if we can replace all the fossil fuels, coal, oil and gas, with renewable electricity from solar and wind, a little bit from hydroelectricity, then we are addressing 3/4 of all greenhouse gas emissions. The rest, by the way, is really difficult. Agriculture and waste and industry, we'll get there, but we won't get to zero. But we can get to zero in the energy sectors. And the way to do that, of course, is, as I said, to use electricity. And once we get there, we get to what I call the electric planet, where all of our primary energy comes from electricity and is used across all the sectors. The trouble is that even though electricity is incredibly versatile, it's not the most convenient way of delivering energy 100% of the time, maybe 80 to 85% of the time, but 15 to 20% of the time, we need some molecules, a high density fuel or a chemical for industrial purposes. So enter stage left, no surprise, hydrogen, which can be used in the built environment for building heating and hot water, which can be used in industry for steel making and other purposes. Transport, heavy transport, it's easier to see how that can be done for long distance heavy haul transport and for ships, and one day for aviation. And for a country like Australia in particular, hydrogen and its derivatives such as ammonia will be an extraordinary export opportunity for us. So I am talking about hydrogen, but truly what we're talking about here is a tale of two molecules, the hydrogen molecule and the NH3 ammonia molecule. I'm going to focus on hydrogen, but in many, many cases, the energy or the chemical value will be distributed and used as ammonia. So I'd like to tell you about the hydrogen dream, but I thought I'd stop for a moment and tell you about the hydrogen nightmares, or the 3 things that wake me up at night. Because even though the prospects are fantastic, there are some things that we have to address. And the first one might sound a little surprising that I should even mention it, but hydrogen storage. And part of the reason you might find it surprising that I'm mentioning it is I hardly hear anybody ever talk about hydrogen storage, except for NASA. Now, NASA, for the SLS, the gigantic rocket that they're building for carrying 100 tons or thereabouts into orbit and beyond, the first stage is a liquid hydrogen, liquid oxygen stage. And so NASA has built a massive liquid hydrogen spherical tank. I can't find how much it costs, but NASA doesn't really understand the concept of millions. It's probably $1 billion, holds 653 tons of liquid hydrogen. So how much electricity, if you were using that to regenerate electricity, if your interest was long-term deep storage, how much electricity is that? So a little bit of arithmetic, bear with me. You need 30 kilograms of hydrogen to get a megawatt hour of electricity. That's the chemical content. But if you take into account maybe 50% efficiency, you need about 60 kilograms of hydrogen for a megawatt hour, or 60 tons of hydrogen for a gigawatt hour. So this tank, which holds 653 tons, effectively holds the ability, if it was used for deep storage in the electricity grid, to deliver 11 gigawatt hours, which is about a half a day for a 1 gigawatt generator, which is a lot, but it's still very small in the grand scheme of things in a future all electricity grid. So storage is a big concern. We have to come up with means of either below ground or underground storage that are cheap and scalable. The second is trust. How do buyers know that their clean hydrogen is, as I put it there, is well clean? Or would you buy hydrogen from this man, from Vincent van Price? Well, yes, if he came to you holding a guarantee of origin certificate, which we need, a certificate that tells you the country of origin, what the technology was, and both of those are for your comfort, but they're not really important. The single important metric is how much carbon dioxide was emitted in production per kilogram or per tonne of hydrogen. And the Australian government and international counterparts are developing such a guarantee of origin certificate, but I see that as one of the most important requirements for a credible international trade in hydrogen. And it's moving slower than I had hoped. And the third, talking about speed, is the pace of change. The IPCC report has come out with a strong report recently, the Code Red report, as people call it, on the rate of change of temperature and the poor rate of progress of countries around the world doing something about it. I've taken some poetic liberty by showing the blue planet with a shade of red, but you know what I mean. So many people feel that sense of urgency, that the panic, that we need to move and move quickly. So we have a responsibility to build the alternatives. You can't just shut down fossil fuels. You have to build the alternatives that will replace them. And we really don't have a lot of time. When a challenge is long in duration and difficult, the most important time to start is now. And we have started, but we need to build up the speed. And the challenge on building up the speed is more on the demand side. I am convinced that in Australia, for sure, producers are poised, and we'll hear more about this today, are poised to produce massive quantities of hydrogen. But they need offtake agreements. We need to build the demand. At the moment, if you look at the supply and demand equation, as a chicken and an egg, the chicken's much bigger and the egg's very smaller. So what will make the egg bigger? Well, if we start using hydrogen in storage for regenerating electricity, that will build hydrogen demand. If we start, and the egg gets bigger, if we start using it in transport, that will build demand. If we use it in industrial feedstock, if we do gas blending, if we build on that export potential, we will be building demand in Australia and in other countries. Let me give you some examples very quickly of how we can do that. Electricity generation in Japan, Mitsubishi and other big generator turbine companies are preparing their turbines to be hydrogen ready. This particular 228 megawatt turbine is a sort of turbine you can buy from Mitsubishi today that will run on natural gas today, but it's field upgradable to ultimately run on 100% hydrogen. For the existing coal-fired generators, Japan has a clear strategy to use ammonia made from clean hydrogen in co-firing, and the conglomerate called JERA is quite committed to getting to 20% ammonia at least one large coal power plant by 2024. Transport. Japan, more than any other country, recognises the importance of hydrogen for transport. I had to show you these two cars. The one on the right is my Tesla that I've had for 6 years, and the one on my left, on the left as you look at it, is my brand new Toyota Mirai that is replacing my Tesla. But the big end of transport also needs a solution. What I'm showing you there is a picture of a marine diesel engine. They are absolutely enormous, and all the big manufacturers around the world have programs in place to modify their diesel engines to run on ammonia as an alternative to running on diesel. In industrial feedstock, hydrogen is going to be the solution for producing green steel, and ammonia is going to be critically important. The replacement of existing ammonia used for fertilizers, for explosives used in the mining industry will be critically important too. And that's a picture of the Yarra Pilbara ammonia plant, which has just started a program of gradually, in multiple phases, replacing its conventional hydrogen made from fossil fuels without CCS with renewable hydrogen to make clean ammonia. Gas blending into the reticulated gas network. Recently, just a few months ago in South Australia, they launched a program for about 700 homes to operate on 5% renewable gas. I was there for the launch with Ben Wilson, the CEO. What's more interesting than the picture of myself or Ben is inside the yellow circle, you'll see the point where the hydrogen is coming down and injecting in and mixing with the natural gas going back to the people of the Mitchell Park community. Export potential for Australia, we have, as you are well aware, terrific solar exposure and wind as well. That's just a map of the solar exposure. We have the other benefit of a low population density. In Australia, it's only 3. In Japan, it's 336. So our solar and wind, combined with our land and our project experience and financing, make us well set up to be a substantial exporter of clean hydrogen and clean ammonia. As does our location on the map. I've got a circle here called the Valerie Pieris Circle, which is really quite famous for a single reason. That circle encloses 50% of the world's population. 50% of the world's population, extremely accessible for Australia's exports. Japan, Korea, China, India, etc. And our government policy, as Fiona was indicating, is very important for advancing an industry like this. This is a new and difficult industry. It's being done for, we are investing in this for external reasons, not because it's obviously the cheapest way forward. And so government policy has to help it along. The Technology Investment Roadmap is the signature approach that the Australian government is taking. I'm the chair of the panel that advises on that. The principles are to achieve net zero through the use of technology, low emissions technology, while supporting jobs, industry and exports, and ending up with low cost, reliable energy for everybody. In a sense, our vision is to have our cake and eat it too, or as was said by somebody famous, cake, have, eat. Now, who said that? You probably think it was Yoda. It wasn't, it was Boris. The roadmap has a small portfolio of priority technologies, and each of them has a stretch goal. So the 5 technologies currently there, and it will expand when we come out with the update in a few weeks. Clean hydrogen, electricity storage, zero emissions metals, carbon capture and storage, and soil organic carbon measurement. As I said, each of them has a stretch goal. For hydrogen, it's the famous one, hydrogen under $2 production price, so at the farm gate, if you like. I won't go through the rest, but I will say that to help achieve these stretch goals, the government is investing upwards of $18 billion minimum this decade, and we are now looking at deployment pathways that will assist industry to get there. We're doing international bilateral partnerships and many other things to help advance these projects. International collaboration is important. And you do see some fantastic examples. So in the Latrobe Valley, earlier this year, they started the pilot plant for coal gasification, ultimately with CCS. And that was a bit of a milestone for us in Victoria and therefore for Australia. That's what you might call blue hydrogen, but with certificates of origin to prove, credibly done, its emissions credentials. Andrew will talk, I'm sure, about the Asian Renewable Energy Hub, which is a massive project out in the Pilbara. 26 gigawatts of electricity from wind and solar to produce hydrogen and ammonia. And I know that that project is in deep and meaningful discussions with Japanese counterparts for offtake. And finally, let me mention that a few months ago, in my role as the special advisor to the Australian government, assisting on international opportunities, I was able to lead the process of the Prime Minister, ultimately from both countries, signing an agreement called the Bilateral Partnership, which is looking at technologies such as CCS, green steel, low emissions hydrogen, even LNG, whose production is done with zero emissions, obviously not the burning. All of these low emissions technologies have been packaged up, and now we're in the implementation phase to see how we can draw industry from both countries in to effectively shift the dial to help us achieve zero emissions carbon dioxide. So thank you very much, and I'll hand back to you, Fiona.
Thank you so much, Alan. Sorry, thank you so much. It was lovely to hear from you. And I always appreciate not only the great way you explain things, but your wonderful animations and pictures. So thank you. So it's my great pleasure to now welcome Mr. Shigeru or Sam Muraki as our next speaker. Mr. Muraki is the Executive Advisor for Tokyo Gas and was Program Director of Energy Carriers for SIP, Cross-Ministerial Strategic Innovation Promotion Program, from June 2014 to March 2019. And importantly for us today, he's the Representative Director from the Clean Fuel Ammonia Association and has been since July 2019. And since May 2016, Mr. Muraki has been Regional Vice Chair, Asia Pacific and South Asia of the World Energy Council. So thank you so much for joining us, Mr. Muraki, and over to you.
Thank you, Fiona-san. Julian, could you share my slides, please? Ladies and gentlemen, very good morning. Thank you for this opportunity to participate in this important dialogue between Australia and Japan and key trading partners, and to present clean fuel ammonia supply and value chain between two countries. Next, please. IEA indicated in their previous hydrogen report in 2019, ammonia is the cheapest mechanism to transport hydrogen from Australia to Japan, and clean fuel ammonia value chain is close to be implemented. As you look at this chart, in the utilization side, coal power plant, we just started large-scale demonstration of 20% mix combustion in 1 gigawatt coal power station owned by JERA, which Alan mentioned, through 2024. Then they will move to the commercial use of ammonia in coal power plant at around 2026-7, and 1 gigawatt power station with 20% mixture of ammonia consumes 500,000 tons of ammonia, and JERA has a 2 gigawatt power station at the site of Nagoya, Hekinan, and so 500,000 to 1 million tons of the demand is expected in 2026 to 27. And Japanese power companies will use ammonia to reduce the carbon dioxide emissions from the coal power plant and increase the coal firing ratio through the 2030s. And also ammonia utilization will be expanded to the gas turbines and industrial furnaces and marine engines. In terms of gas turbines, medium size 2 megawatt to 40 megawatt gas turbines, single fuel ammonia system will be developed by 2025. Combined cycle will take a little more time, but will be developed before 2030. So by 2030, we will have a lineup of the ammonia power production by coal power plant and gas turbines. Industrial furnaces, we just started the demonstration of the glass melting furnaces and mixed combustion of ammonia into the natural gas. And another large potential market is a maritime market. Marine diesel engine using ammonia will be developed by 2025, and there are excuse me, there are plans to build and launch the ammonia fueled vessels around 2026 to 2027. So the maritime fuel is the promising market for fuel ammonia. IEA indicated that the 46% of the maritime fuel will be switched to fuel ammonia by 2050. And particularly the deep sea shippings will use ammonia for decarbonization. And the demand in Japan in 2030, we expect 3 to 5 million tons per year. And by 2050, demand will be more than 30 million tons. And we will expand the use of ammonia to Asian power market. Particularly, there are a lot of the coal power plant in Asia and maritime market. Over 100 million tons of the supply chain will be realized by 2050 in mainly the Asian market. If you look at the supply side, our key target is to develop the green ammonia supply chain, but our strategy is to develop the sizable market by using cost-effective blue ammonia. And once the market is developed, we will introduce green ammonia, and the development of the size of the green ammonia supply will reduce the cost of the green ammonia production, and 2030s, that green ammonia will be the major supply of the clean fuel ammonia. Next, please. There are a lot of potential green and blue ammonia supplies from Australia and Western Australia, South Australia, Queensland, and Tasmania. Some of those projects are fairly large, like Alan mentioned about the Asian Renewable Energy Hub, with the 20 to 40 gigawatt renewable power to produce more than 1 million tons of hydrogen, more than 10 million tons of ammonia. We are planning to deploy large vessels to transport large-scale ammonia supply, and with the capacity of 50 to 80,000 tons, which is double or triple of the existing ammonia carriers, to accommodate large-scale ammonia carriers. And we are planning to develop large-scale import hub terminals in Japan, and then develop the secondary delivery system to supply clean fuel ammonia into the various locations of the potential users to accelerate the decarbonization in Japan. And ammonia is easy to store, easy to transport. So this kind of the system can be applied to the ammonia delivery system. Clean fuel ammonia supply and value chain is a strategic new energy chain between Australia and Japan, a long-term trading partner through coal, iron ore, and LNG, and strong collaboration of the government and industry between those two countries are essential, as Alan mentioned. And this carbon-free fuel ammonia value chain will contribute to the industry, economy, society, and environment of those two countries, Australia and Japan. I'll stop my presentation now. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Muraki-san. It was lovely to hear from you. It was great to have you speak. I'm going to hand over to our co-host now. So Andrew Dickson from the Ammonia Energy Association Australia and Development Manager from CWP Global. Over to you, Andrew.
Thanks, Fiona. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us this morning. As Alan mentioned earlier, I'm heavily involved in the development of green ammonia export projects, both here in Australia and overseas. But really, I'm here today wearing a different hat, which is as chair of the Australia Committee for the Ammonia Energy Association. So the AEA is the peak body for ammonia energy globally, and it's been promoting the use of ammonia in a sustainable energy economy since 2004. It was originally known as the Ammonia Fuels Network, and then it became the NH3 Fuel Association in 2009, and then it became the Ammonia Energy Association in 2018. It's based globally in New York, but it's been very active in Australia for several years. And it's actually the first formal presence that's been created for the AEA outside of the US. So a year ago, we established a formal entity in Australia and a dedicated Australia committee of the global body, the AEA. And this really reflects the significant activity and potential in Australia for ammonia energy production and export. So ammonia is the second most commonly produced chemical in the world, about 180 million tonnes per year, of which about 20 million tonnes is traded globally. Large-scale production of ammonia began just before the First World War, so just over a century ago, with two Germans, Fritz Haber and Karl Bosch. They pioneered the Haber-Bosch process that you may have heard of. At the moment, most ammonia is used for fertilizers, and arguably, fertilizers and large-scale ammonia production has made one of the biggest impacts on humanity in terms of increasing food production dramatically. Ammonia is also widely used today as a refrigerant in large refrigeration systems and as a feedstock for the production of explosives. However, ammonia can be used for much more than just the current uses. It also can become a carbon-free fuel. Sam just touched upon, a lot of the work in Japan for using ammonia to co-fire in coal-fired power stations, in ship engines, industrial furnaces, and so on. And in this case, the hydrogen in ammonia, NH3, is the valuable portion, whereas in fertilizers, the nitrogen is. So yeah, it's really focusing now on the hydrogen. So the AEA believes that a big part of the hydrogen future is an ammonia future. And as Sam just mentioned, it's much easier to store and transport ammonia as a liquid than hydrogen. It's been safely produced, stored and transported for decades. Importantly, there are well over 100 terminals at ports around the world which can already handle ammonia. And there are very large new markets emerging for ammonia energy, as Sam just described. So there are many ammonia energy projects proliferating to support this future, particularly in Australia. It represents a really significant trade and investment opportunity between Australia and Japan, building off decades of trade and investment experience, as Sam just said, in iron ore, natural gas, coal, and other commodities. So we've got two excellent speakers today from two of the companies who are very active developing hydrogen and ammonia export projects in Australia, Fortescue Future Industries and Sumitomo Australia. So our first speaker is Felicity Underhill, who commenced just this year actually as Director Australia for the Eastern States for Fortescue Future Industries. Felicity has worked for 20 years in the oil and gas sector, but she's focused on hydrogen since 2018, most recently as the General Manager for Future Fuels at Origin Energy. And she's also the Director and Deputy Chair of the Australian Hydrogen Council. She has a history of developing and delivering strategies across new industry development, major organisational transformation and innovation. So she'll bring the lessons that she's learned working in over 25 countries, during her career with Shell, as well as more recent experience in the development of the LNG industry in Queensland. In particular, her style of moving quickly, creating strong partnerships and high-performing teams will be a key enabler for FFI's green hydrogen ambitions in Australia. So over to you, Felicity.
Thanks, Andrew. And I'd just like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the many lands on which we meet today. For me, here in Brisbane, that's the Yagara and the Turrbal people. And I think this acknowledgement's really important, particularly for those of us who are involved in projects which rely on the amazing natural resources of Australia. Now, we've heard today and we've talked for some time about the transition to a sustainable and commercially viable hydrogen industry. There's a common assumption that that transition will require starting with fossil fuel derived hydrogen, with or without the carbon captured, before being able to move on to the ultimate goal of green or renewable hydrogen. Over the last few years, we've all seen slides comparing the cost of renewables derived hydrogen today versus the cost of fossil fuel derived hydrogen, likewise showing the comparative availability of those two products. And I understand the desire to be able to build that end user market so that demand is available as supplies come on stream. I want to add to some of Muraki-san's comments about this transition and talk through why I think the world has moved on from requiring a blue transition and build the case to go straight to green. I'm going to make 3 points around availability, readiness, and demand. So availability of green hydrogen. Many of the arguments to start using blue or grey hydrogen and kickstarting all areas of a hydrogen economy come from the assumption that there isn't or won't be sufficient green hydrogen available. If we want to build the major export and import technologies required to establish trade routes and a reliable supply chain, we should use the most readily available hydrogen. That makes sense. But let me give you some more information. The availability of green hydrogen is growing fast and accelerating. Here at Fortescue Future Industries, we have a target of 15 million tonnes per annum of green hydrogen by 2030 and growing to 50 million tonnes beyond that. Now, we're not alone in forecasting such large green volumes. Major projects elsewhere in Australia, such as Andrews, plus those in the Middle East, are going to add significant early volumes of green hydrogen. Those volumes will be sufficient to start decarbonising existing industrial demand for hydrogen, such as replacing grey ammonia, as well as support demand growth for hydrogen for energy. And I think this is particularly in the early days in diesel replacement. To put that 15 million tonnes per annum in context, as Muraki-san mentioned, Japan's updated strategic roadmap for hydrogen and fuel cell technologies targets consumption of just 3 million tonnes per annum of hydrogen by 2030. With that increased scale and availability of green hydrogen comes the much needed and much faster cost reduction. One of the things I've seen over working in hydrogen for the last few years is that every time a consultant puts forward a piece of analysis showing the trajectory of both hydrogen production and hydrogen costs, the curve has both moved further to the left than last time, so showing that growth and cost reduction is sooner than previously expected, and is already out of date, with actual projects already being larger and at lower cost than forecast. This gives me great hope. And part of this is to do with my second point, technology readiness. Electrolyzers are known technology, particularly alkaline, and they have been built and used effectively for years. Yes, we need to scale up manufacturing capacity. Yes, there will be challenges associated with that scale up, such as accessing specific markets and metals and catalysts. But this is a complicated challenge, not a complex one. And when you combine that with using renewable electricity generation technology, which has rapidly scaled and improved over the past 20 years, plus well-known ammonia conversion technology and existing ammonia shipping and storage, the technology readiness of a green hydrogen to ammonia supply chain is reasonably mature. Yes, more investment will be needed to provide scale and to also locate that ammonia next to new centres of demand. But that's not a technology readiness issue so much as it is an investment case. I'd just quietly point out as well the relative state of carbon capture and storage technology, the technology that's required to turn fossil fuel derived hydrogen from grey to blue. And I think this faces far more challenges and unknowns when it comes to scaling up than in green hydrogen, particularly in both the capture stage and in the storage stage. We all know there have been multiple CCS projects announced over recent years, but few of them are operating or have managed operations at their design scale. Finally, I'd like to talk about demand. And I've spoken to potential hydrogen and ammonia customers around the world over the past few years, and they tend to fall into two camps. Some are driven purely by carbon accounting and reporting and a need to meet announced net zero targets. Others are taking more of what I refer to as a free-range eggs approach, looking at the ethicality of their purchase across a range of ESG principles, renewable energy, sustainable water, labour rights, for example, and contributions to meeting the UN Sustainable Development Goals. This is particularly interesting to customers who have line of sight to the needs and wishes of their end user consumers. And so we therefore need to give our customers and end users certainty regarding both the source of energy carried by the hydrogen we sell and the carbon footprint of the hydrogen they buy. Well to gate or well to wheel, including the short term, so the 20-year global warming potential of any fugitive methane emissions, will be important to provide this transparency. We know there have been recent studies pointing out the residual carbon footprint of fossil fuel derived hydrogen, even with carbon capture. And to ensure the trust and belief in our burgeoning industry, we need to acknowledge and measure this. So this tells me two things. One, there is demand for renewable hydrogen as separate from just low carbon hydrogen. And two, there is a need for transparency and certification, such as Alan mentioned, and the work the Australian Hydrogen Council is doing with the federal government and our trading partners via the International Partnership for Hydrogen and Fuel Cells in the Economy, or the IPHE. Hydrogen benchmarks, which include broader ESG criteria, will also be useful in supporting customers to choose their supply. So if you're going to take anything away from my comments this morning, let it be this. If green renewable hydrogen is the ultimate goal in transitioning to a hydrogen economy, then it's possible for us to start there. The demand is there, the technology is there, and importantly, with companies such as FFI contributing 15 million tonnes of green hydrogen by 2030, the supply is there as well. Thanks, Andrew.
Great, thank you very much, Felicity, and I look forward to the panel discussion shortly. Our next speaker for this morning, and the last speaker, is Alana Barlow. Alana is Sumitomo Australia's National Hydrogen Commercialisation Manager. Sumitomo Australia is a subsidiary of Sumitomo Corporation, a global trading and investment house headquartered in Tokyo. Sumitomo has recently established the Energy Innovation Initiative, tasked with fast-tracking Sumitomo's net zero 2050 goal, and the hydrogen business department plays a pivotal role in this. Despite a previous life as a commercial lawyer, Alana is experienced in mineral resources and power infrastructure projects throughout Australia with upstream and downstream applications. So welcome, Alana. We can't hear you at the moment, Alana.
There we go. Sorry,
there you go. Well done.
I moved my controls. Thank you so much for that introduction, Andrew, and I hope everyone can now see my screen. Good morning, ohayou gozaimasu, to our Australian and Japanese peers joining this morning, and what a wonderful morning of hydrogen conversation from the industry's best. I hope you've all had your morning coffee and have been able to keep up. So now you're a little bit familiar with me, let's talk about Sumitomo's work in decarbonisation through hydrogen, one of my personal passions. So hydrogen energy. We've heard this morning why it's such a hot topic and why it's important to Australia and Japan. Australia produces hydrogen, Japan receives and uses it. It's that simple. Or is it? At Sumitomo, we don't think so. Domestic hydrogen utilisation needs to be at the core, at the heart of this new industry. As a trading house, we've always walked the fine line between demand and supply. And in this instance, there is a need for domestic hydrogen industry in Australia, as well as export. All paths do lead to export, and the economies of scale are undeniable in that context. But let me talk a little bit about this diagram, which showcases our simple yet effective philosophy to the hydrogen industry. Sumitomo has been working on hydrogen in Australia since about 2015 or 16. And at that point, we developed this concept of create, customize, and cultivate. In facilitating a sustainable hydrogen industry, we first need to concentrate on creating that domestic demand and supply, starting small, making hydrogen available and seeding those pilot projects. From there, we customize, facilitating the uptake of hydrogen for industrial applications, working towards the goal of achieving a zero emissions region. While we are customizing, we are also cultivating, always working towards that export goal. Matching international demand with supply capabilities in Australia. And on this point, I'd like to acknowledge that Japan is currently agnostic to blue and green hydrogen. So there is a place for both blue and green in Japan's roadmap to decarbonisation. So how do you create that early hydrogen industry? Early promotion, support and advocacy of hydrogen industry is crucial. Sumitomo has some early roots in hydrogen programs in Australia. One of the earliest programs that piqued our interest was the Advanced Lignite Demonstration Project. Seeing the writing on the wall for hydrogen, we also sponsored the CSIRO National Hydrogen Roadmap in 2018, which was an essential report responsible for triggering huge interest in hydrogen in Australia. Now, it's also important to support our NERA technology clusters, who are tasked with building skills, capability, and commercialization opportunities for hydrogen. Without support and facilitation from key industry players, it is a challenging environment for the hydrogen industry to thrive. Similarly, supporting our universities, who are at the forefront of research, technology development, and the evolution of industry, is essential. These are all important activities in the creation phase with pathways towards decarbonisation. So how else do you create? By building your hydrogen credentials. One of the great things about being a trading house is our access to hydrogen projects at all points in the value chain globally. Whether it be investing in hydrogen technology specific venture capital funds, looking at hydropower to hydrogen in Sarawak, Malaysia, using MCH as the export vector, mining decarbonisation opportunities, or engaging in the design of a smart city centred around hydrogen energy, all of these projects build those hydrogen credentials, which are critical to the creation phase. And these are the credentials which bring so much value to our Gladstone hydrogen ecosystem project. So I think this may well be the only time that I agree with a headline from the Courier Mail, but they're quite right that Gladstone will be the hydrogen capital of the world. Sure, there's great solar radiance and reasonable wind turbine projects planned, and that port, now she's a beauty. But what makes Gladstone really attractive is its industry. Industry that is hugely energy intensive with significant carbon emissions. Gladstone is attractive as the hydrogen capital of the world because of its domestic opportunity. So how do you create? Through bringing together those foundational partners who will help materialize a hydrogen ecosystem. Earlier this year, we partnered with some of those organisations, Gladstone Ports, Gladstone Regional Council, Central Queensland University, and AJIG. All of these organisations are motivated to deliver the hydrogen industry to Gladstone. The group provides key facilitation as well as offtake opportunities. It is the beginning of a long-standing partnership. Now, we're also working on social licence in Gladstone, really bringing the community along for the ride on this. We've co-created a hydrogen vision with Gladstonites, and we're really excited to be delivering that later in the week in Gladstone. Now, backing up all of this work, Sumitomo announced a letter of intent with Rio Tinto, key aluminium industry players in Gladstone. Rio Tinto are investigating the use of hydrogen to replace natural gas in their calcination process at the Yarwun refinery, and Sumitomo is investigating the supply of hydrogen for that opportunity. Now, seeding domestic hydrogen projects for commencement in 2023 is crucial. We need to get green hydrogen into the regions earlier than 2025 to truly be able to facilitate the scale up of industrial hydrogen in Australia. So let's talk about the customization phase. By now, you've already helped to facilitate the skills and education and the development of technology. You've also had a roaring success in launching hydrogen mobility projects and have a few hydrogen pilot projects under your belt. Decarbonisation is on everybody's lips. The seeds of your hydrogen industry have been sown and are now starting to sprout. Customisation is a time to scale up industrial hydrogen use. We want to see fleet mobility projects, cars, trucks, buses, prime movers, mining vehicles, even trains. There's considerable offtake there. But the real opportunity is in industrial heat. Hydrogen is a great replacement for natural gas, and with so many industrial organisations setting 2050 and even 2030 carbon emissions reductions goals, there is a role for hydrogen to play. Gladstone in particular is Australia's best opportunity for this, with hundreds of thousands of tonnes of hydrogen required, a real decarbonisation opportunity. So cultivation. This is where we talk about export. As a trading house, all paths will always lead to export, balancing that demand and supply. And we see ammonia as a really key pathway for early adopters of hydrogen, one of the earliest opportunities for industries to commence decarbonisation. The existing supply chains and demonstrated applications really make NH3 a credible vector for early users. Co-firing of ammonia in coal-fired power plants, as mentioned by Muraki-san, opens up huge opportunities for the ammonia industry to help carbon-emitting power infrastructure companies get ahead of the 2030 Paris Agreement targets. Now, we are working on a consortium in Singapore, including Maersk no less, who are determined to use ammonia as a marine bunker fuel replacement. Ammonia-powered shipping vessels are already being developed. The time for ammonia is right now. Now, on behalf of this consortia, Sumitomo this year issued a request for information for blue and green ammonia projects and their earliest available supply dates. An RFP for this project is not far away for supply by 2025. Now, when you have a player like Maersk wanting access to clean ammonia as a marine fuel alternative, the decarbonisation of shipping fleet is here at our doorstep. Ammonia is a great option for Gladstone. It already has an existing import supply chain. And a little hot tip, there's a great location in the port of Gladstone, which is in prime position for an ammonia export terminal. Now, while Sumitomo is vector neutral, all with their pros and cons, ammonia presents an undeniable opportunity to bridge the gap between the need for decarbonisation right now and the maturity of the pathway to decarbonisation. And again, in cultivation, balancing that demand with supply, we are also working in the Chubu Hydrogen Utilisation Study Group, focusing on hydrogen demand, receival and distribution in Nagoya. Toyota Motor Corporation, SMBC and Sumitomo are leading the charge, and leading the charge in the way only a trading house knows how, by balancing demand from 2025 to 2030 and beyond, and supply from Gladstone and beyond. So what are the hurdles to decarbonising Australia and Japan's industry through hydrogen? Offtake, something Dr. Finkel knows all too well. And the challenge to offtake is twofold: supply and price. As the former CEO of one of Japan's major gas companies previously said, and I'm definitely paraphrasing, if you can give me firm supply at the right price, I'll give you an offtake agreement. Now, Japan's Green Innovation Fund will go a long way to assisting with the price. Now it's just the supply side. For now, though, it is so important to sustainably create a hydrogen ecosystem with a focus on domestic demand until those export industries are ready. And you can bet that when export is ready, so too will Sumitomo be. Thank you. Over to you, Andrew.
Excellent, Alana. Thank you very much. And thank you to all of our speakers. So now it's time for the panel discussion. Fiona and I have some questions for the presenters, but hopefully we'll have some time to ask the questions that you've all asked today. If you've got other questions that are burning, please use the Zoom Q&A feature. And I'd encourage the presenters to feel free to answer those with written answers in the meantime, in case we don't get to them verbally. So I'll hand over now to Fiona for the first question for the panel.
Great, thank you so much. So it's been great to hear from everyone. Really interested to then dive a bit deeper into some of the issues that are coming up. So first question, I might put to Alan in the first instance. So we know that hydrogen and ammonia are intrinsically linked. What do you see when you think of these markets, competitors or allies? And how does ammonia facilitate and supercharge the coming hydrogen transition?
Fiona, I definitely see allies, although you really can't say the world is just competitors or allies. I'm a believer in both competition and collaboration. Two C words, too often is a focus on one or the other, and there's a huge role for both. Sometimes you collaborate prior to going out and competing. Sometimes you just go out and compete, collaborate, etc. You know, I see huge opportunity for both molecules. There's no question of it. Ammonia is probably the one that the broader community doesn't even recognise as having any relevance at all. Everybody's heard about hydrogen. Very few people have heard about ammonia for industrial purposes, and the opportunity for ammonia in the maritime industry that's already been discussed, in co-firing and as a chemical feedstock, is just enormous. It's hard to describe how large that opportunity is, and it's also very hard to see alternatives for something like the maritime industry. Synthetic fuels like methane and methanol will always be more expensive. There's just more processing, and you need a source of carbon dioxide, which will disappear in future unless you capture it from the air, and that makes it very expensive. So I see big opportunities for ammonia, obviously the large opportunities for hydrogen, especially between our two countries, Japan and Australia, the opportunity to use hydrogen in steel making, to make zero emission steel. And everybody needs to remember that steel making is the single biggest greenhouse gas emitting industrial process in the world by far, head and shoulders above cement, which is, I think, number 2. And there are exotic alternatives, but hydrogen is the obvious solution. Now, that has to be a real collaboration, because Japan is a powerhouse on steel products and steel making. We are a powerhouse on iron ore exporting. There's no point having a green steel process if your product coming in isn't green. And so Fortescue and other Australian mining companies have to, and they are, invest in eliminating emissions entirely from their mining process, through the drills, the excavators, the crushers and the haulers. They have to eliminate emissions entirely from their trains that take the product to the port. And that's more likely to be ammonia than anything else. So on site at the mining site, it's going to be hydrogen, batteries, solar and wind, but the trains are probably going to be ammonia, and the ships are probably going to be ammonia, getting the product to Japan. And that would use Japanese technology, Japanese offtake agreements. So it's collaboration all the way in that established supply chain. There will be enormous worldwide competition between the different countries who are steel making giants. Ideally, Australia will be supplying to all of them, but the relationship with Japan has been very, very special for many years.
Alan, I've got another question for you relating to steel in a moment, but firstly, I'll hand over to ask a question of Sam and Felicity. So you've both got extensive backgrounds in the LNG industry. So what similarities and differences do you see between the LNG industry over the last few decades and the emerging hydrogen industry? So what could be done differently or better as we go again with hydrogen and derivatives? So first, Sam, please.
Thank you. Similarity of the LNG and ammonia or hydrogen supply chain, it's a collaboration between suppliers and off-takers with the long-term commitment of the supply and demand. But in terms of the new scheme of the ammonia, we are looking at not the collaboration, the partnership between the producer and an off-taker, and a strong partnership with the commitment, and also share the benefit of the project for long term. That is the key, particularly for the green ammonia production and ammonia scheme. So that will create the bankable project to start. So that is slightly different part of this from the LNG, but most of the off-takers wants to have the pricing formula to understand or to reduce the volatility of the products, not linked to the fertilizer market. It's very volatile market because of the open market. The price is determined by demand and supply. So those are some changes or similarity from the LNG value chain.
Okay, thanks, Sam. Felicity, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, thanks, Muraki-san. And I completely agree with the need for partnerships and the opportunity for partnerships, and particularly including offtake partners in the development of projects. I think the additional lessons that we have, and here I'll think specifically about the development of the onshore gas to LNG industry in Queensland, has a lot of similarities and lessons for us as we go to develop a new industry. One is collaboration, particularly around common user infrastructure, and it's getting some very clear direction and working closely hand in hand with state and federal governments about kind of master planning some of that equipment so that we can ensure the most efficient use of capital. It's really important as we're trying to get the costs down. And the other piece, as Alana mentioned, is really ensuring that we have the balance right between domestic use of the product we produce and the export of that product. It's one thing for us to talk about producing green hydrogen to help decarbonize the world. It's another thing if we start talking about just exporting Australia's water without being able to talk people through the benefits of that and the important benefits of that for local users as well. So I think there are two key ones there, Andrew. It's that collaboration of producers and ensuring that we get the balance of demand domestically as well as export right.
Thank you both. Now I've got another question for Sam. We've heard a bit today about Japan's pioneering work developing and applying technologies for co-firing ammonia, hydrogen gas turbines and so on. What is Japan's thinking and timing around exporting those technologies to other countries in the region to help them decarbonise and to create more demand for Australian hydrogen and ammonia exports?
Okay, it's a good question, and in particular, that the mixed combustion of ammonia in coal-fired power plant, we are planning to export to the Asian countries. For instance, tomorrow we'll have an international ammonia, fuel ammonia conference jointly organized by our CFAR and the METI government, and there will be the signing ceremony between IHI, Tenaga National, and Petronas to export the mixed combustion technology in coal-fired power plant to be applied in Malaysia. In Asian countries, there are 2,000 gigawatts of the coal power station capacity, the average age of 12 to 13 years old. So it is very difficult to stop those coal power plants in 10 years of time. So that ammonia could be the one of the best options to reduce the carbon dioxide emissions from coal, and eventually they can use the ammonia infrastructure to develop the carbon-free power production using ammonia. So they do not need the investment twice. Just one-time investment for ammonia can go into the zero emission society in Asia.
Thank you, Sam. Now I'm going to quickly just jump back to Alan before handing over to Fiona. So with my steel question. So Australia is a major exporter of the inputs to the steelmaking process, iron ore, thermal coal and metallurgical coal. And obviously, we've heard today that we could become a very large producer and exporter of hydrogen and its derivatives. Do you see decarbonised steelmaking in our region continuing on more or less as they currently are, with major steelmakers in China, Japan, and Korea, and us exporting the raw materials? Or do you think it's realistic for more value adding to occur in Australia? Is our iron ore suitable? Do you think the economics will work? Can we do more value adding here, or will it just be exporting a different input to overseas steelmakers?
Andrew, thanks. That's certainly a crystal ball kind of question. There is, under a hydrogen steelmaking scenario, ample opportunity for a shifting of the boundary, with collaboration and support from Japan in this case, working with us in Australia. The economics of shipping are going to make a difference. So today, if Australia ships all the ingredients such as iron ore and coal, the high density of both materials means that the shipping cost, while it adds to the ultimate cost, is not a significant component. But if we're shipping iron ore and hydrogen, the number of shipments of hydrogen is quite large to get the hydrogen that you need to make the steel in another country. And then that other country is going to need a lot of renewable electricity to go with it. So there is some strong rationale for a higher value add proposition in Australia. That's more likely to be something like hot briquetted iron, which is an intermediate product. But by then you've taken your electricity, your renewable electricity locally, your locally made hydrogen, your iron ore, and produce a high density, reasonably high value product for shipping to countries such as Japan, where it'll be put into an electric arc furnace and turn into, with the right alloying process, and turn into the appropriate steel and ultimately the appropriate steel products. So there's a lot of reason to consider that, but time will tell. In terms of our iron ore, there is a lot of discussion about whether the hematite as opposed to magnetite and other people's iron ores, whether it's suitable for hydrogen direct reduced iron ore production. And I'm confident that ultimately it will be through two reasons. One is fine-tuning the direct reduced iron hydrogen process. And second of all, just improvements to the crushing and ore refinement process that we have in Australia.
Andrew, I have
Yes,
one comment about the steel making.
Please.
If that green steel is produced in Australia, definitely the Australia will use hydrogen. But in Japan and in Korea, that the steel makers in Japan and Korea are looking at the ammonia as a feedstock of the green steel, because an ammonia comes to Japan and Korea less expensive than other ways of the hydrogen transportation.
And so, Sam, would that ammonia be cracked back to hydrogen for direct reduction, or is it used directly?
Yeah, they feed the ammonia or hydrogen about 1200 degrees centigrade into the mill. So 1200 centigrade temperature can crack the ammonia to the hydrogen and the nitrogen. And the nitrogen, high temperature nitrogen, will support the temperature reduction in the mill to control the temperature better than the pure hydrogen.
Fascinating. Thanks,
That's
Sam.
the concept.
Great. Now, Fiona.
I was just interested in Felicity's comments on the fact that, so we know that Fortescue's Dr. Andrew Forrest has stated that green steel is this huge manufacturing opportunity for Australia. We could create 40,000 jobs if we capture only 10% of the world's steel market. What do you think are the necessary conditions for that to happen?
Well, I think I think quite broadly around manufacturing, and we actually have a lot of those conditions here in Australia, which is fantastic. We have incredibly capable industrial workforce, which currently very focused on the resources industry, some of which will be entering decline as the world starts to decarbonize, as we move away from coal generation. And so the ability to repoint and transition that workforce into manufacturing and into green manufacturing, I think, is a great opportunity. We have, you know, a lot of the core resources and ingredients, the land and the ports that are required to do this. And so as we start to develop out these strategies, I guess the key thing to recognize is we can't just focus on one part of the supply chain. You know, we need to, if we want to hit these fantastic large targets, we need to make sure that we are enabling every part of the supply chain, whether that is manufacturing in the renewables space, whether that is, you know, manufacturing from an electrolyzer perspective, poles and wires, compression, all of that sort of stuff needs to be included in our plan, as well as the back end of the manufacturing to support end user demand. So, you know, the work that's being done at the moment around Australia and the work that Fortescue's Green Fleet team have been doing with regard to prototyping and manufacturing you know, locomotive engines that will run off a blend of ammonia and diesel, through to marine engines running off that blend and increasing that over time. So there's really the opportunities for Australia in partnering with our partners in Japan to be able to create new manufacturing industries across the whole supply chain.
Now, I've got a couple of questions for Alana. So given Sumitomo's activities with Rio Tinto and Gladstone, what do you think is the potential for hydrogen to help decarbonise the production of aluminium?
Andrew, huge potential. Yep. But let me say I don't speak for Rio in this. Decarbonising calciners in the alumina refineries is critical in terms of achieving that green aluminium. But there are also hydrogen opportunities on the smelting side too. Now, remember that green aluminium and steel is definitely being sought by the market, and I think Australia is very well positioned to be able to meet that demand. But as Dr. Finkel said, there are other opportunities in greening up that entire supply chain, which is so critical. So yes, we do need to look at greening up the power supply, the transport and logistics, but those are much easier problems to solve in order to deliver that green aluminium product.
Now, another question for you, Alana. So you talked about domestic markets and the criticality of starting there before exports. Can you just talk a little bit more about the domestic markets that Sumitomo foresees, both at Gladstone and elsewhere?
Sure. So look, we absolutely need to be focusing on domestic decarbonisation. There's been a huge focus on export. Yes, we hear you, and yes, we'll be ready for it when it comes. But don't underestimate domestic. It has to come first. There is huge potential of hydrogen in industrial heat applications, and in some respects, hydrogen is considered superior to natural gas. But the huge potential of decarbonising Australian industry is that we won't just be exporting molecules in 2025 or 2030, we'll be exporting our knowledge, experience, innovation, and technology at that time.
Great, thanks, Alana. While I've still got you, Alana, so you touched upon social license in the Gladstone project. How critical is social license in developing domestic and then eventually export hydrogen projects and industries? And could you just sort of shed more light on the issue of social license?
Look, this is a really important point that can't be forgotten. It's really easy to think that a big player can waltz into a region and build a large plant for an export market. But the reality isn't that simple, particularly in Gladstone, where they saw the simultaneous construction of 3 LNG plants in the last decade. Now, those LNG plants fueled a boom and bust cycle on those Gladstonites, with those left behind bearing the brunt of that bust. This time around, Gladstone is really keen to see a local first mentality. Produce for us before you produce for the rest of the world, and we're really motivated to see that realised. There's also a desire, of course, to see the FIFO workforce reduced and industry sustainably built this time. But we also need to look to the next generation, consult with our future leaders who currently occupy our schools and our universities. We're creating this next generation of energy for them, so it's incredibly important to consult with them, which we've been doing. And another thing I'd like to mention is the role of our traditional owners. Large-scale hydrogen production using electrolysis will require a vast amount of water, and our traditional owners and First Nations peoples are spiritually connected to that water. So as an industry, we must remain mindful and respectful of that spiritual connection in the way that we operate. So bearing all of this in mind, we did spend some time and quite a bit of money actually, co-creating a hydrogen ecosystem vision with the Gladstonites, which honours and builds on what came before. And I have to say, we're really excited to announce that vision later in Gladstone this week. And we're really excited to bring the community on board with that and start getting things kickstarted in Gladstone.
Thank you.
That's great, Alana. That sounds like a really good piece of work. I'm interested to hear more about it. I've got a question for really anyone who wants to take it up. So Japan and Australia, we've got a warm and trusted relationship and a clear desire to work together to develop hydrogen and ammonia at scale. In that context, what do you think should happen next to get our markets going, and what can each country do to support Team Japan and Team Australia leading and supporting our region? I'm happy to throw that open to whoever wants to respond.
Sam, go.
No, go ahead.
Just at one level, I mentioned, but let me elaborate. The Australian government is pushing hard on low emissions technologies as the means of achieving zero emissions, or as a substantial fraction of the means of achieving zero emissions. And we know that we can't do it all by ourselves. And so I've been working or leading with the Australian government the process of bilateral partnerships, and Japan was one of the first of just a half dozen that we negotiated earlier this year and we have signed. And the actual implementation hasn't been worked out yet, and we will be appealing to industry through an expression of interest process. But what we want to do through these partnerships is set up industry-led technology demonstrator projects in a spectrum of low emissions technologies that are relevant to Japan and Australia. Now, the amount of money, it's in the, say, the $100 million vicinity, so it's not huge, but it's enough to stimulate technology demonstrator projects that are partnerships between Japanese and Australian industries in these selected areas, and ammonia and hydrogen is clearly one of the key areas that we've identified. So listen out for it. There will be announcements in that space. It's not a solution, but it's certainly a significant contributor to building the relationship in this area.
Yeah.
Thanks, Alan. Muraki?
Yeah, that's right. And I agree completely with Alan's comment. Yeah, we have a lot of aspects Team Australia and Team Japan need to do. First, and as I mentioned, to develop the scalable supply project, we need a partnership between industries and between the government and industry, and the government need to support by funding or to support by the giving some incentive to the clean products to use in the market, power generation, the industrial, and that is what we need. And between the government, we need to develop the certification of definitions of the clean hydrogen and clean ammonia. What are those? And so the aspect need to be addressed between the Team Australia and Team Japan. And we are asking Japanese government to help us to develop the infrastructure of the ammonia supply chain in Japan. As I mentioned, that the large scale import hub terminal and secondary delivery system. So marine transportation requires a lot of investment for the marine facilities. So those kind of support we are discussing in Japan. The same as Australia. I think that Australia needs to create a hub terminal to export an ammonia from Western Australia, South Australia.
Okay, now I've got a follow-up question from the audience from Richard Andrews for Alan Finkel. And he asked, creating a hydrogen-based world will necessarily be a global effort. Sellers will want to know they have multiple markets before they invest big. Buyers such as Japan that have significant fuel security concerns will want to know that they have multiple sources of hydrogen. Are governments thinking beyond just certification schemes about how their strategies fit together and working to build frameworks for efficient international markets that create suitable incentives for meeting decarbonisation objectives to emerge? And how could Japan and Australia lead the way in this effort? Big question.
So the question is right to be focusing on building the offtake agreements and the demand. I deeply agree with that. The certification requirements is not to be undervalued. You can't have a large-scale trade in something like hydrogen unless you know something about how it was produced, and you cannot tell anything about the hydrogen from looking at the hydrogen itself. It's completely de-identified by the time you buy it. So the certification is important. Felicity, you were talking a lot about green versus blue. I never participate in the discussion of green versus blue because the only thing that matters in my mind is atmospheric emissions of carbon dioxide associated with producing the hydrogen. And you can produce hydrogen electrolytically, and if you're not careful about every step in the process and use a little bit of grid electricity for whatever reason, your emissions associated with production would go through the roof. So there needs to be a reliable, well-to-gate certification scheme, and whatever hydrogen meets the requirements of the purchasing country and the purchasing company should be valid in that market. So I really do want to emphasize how important the certification is. Beyond that, governments have a huge role, and so do big organizations in directing industry, giving vision to industry. This transition is not something that would happen in the ordinary market-driven circumstances. We're doing this because we all want to decarbonise, and it is expensive. And so the fact that Japan's government works so closely with industry to bring them together to collaborate for a while and then go out and compete in important areas is transformational. I must say, and I've said it before, but not often enough, that when I was leading the development of the Australian National Hydrogen Strategy in 2019, the inspiration for me came from the Japanese strategy, which was the first in the world and made public in December of 2017. And the beautiful thing about the Japanese strategy is not only that it is there for the decarbonisation purpose, but it's very target driven, specific targets. We will have X tonnes by 2030 and X vehicles on the road. And that gives vision to the producers. It gives vision to supplier countries like ours. So to the maximum extent that countries can work with companies to set these micro targets or sector specific targets, that's fantastic. The last thing I'll mention is that in our bilateral agreements, hydrogen is always there. So for example, the one with Germany is only about hydrogen, and Felicity, it's only about green hydrogen, because that's where the German interest is. And so we have a bilateral partnership with Germany specifically on green hydrogen. And Germany has a very interesting program to support industry and volume, where they've actually created a 900 million euro entity that is going to run reverse auctions to buy hydrogen and ammonia, I believe, and reverse auctions to sell it to German customers. And they know that they will burn through that 900 million euros in just a couple of years. That's an expense they're prepared to put into the system to bridge the gap between the producer price and what users are prepared to pay. So governments can do lots of things.
And just to add to that, Alan, I think you're quite right in acknowledging the efforts of the Japanese government in terms of trying to accelerate the hydrogen industry. I would say, even if it is a little bit controversial, that the Australian government does need to do a little bit more. We've got a $2 billion Green Innovation Fund that has been announced by the Japanese government for one project. And while we've got some fantastic funding opportunities at the federal and state at the state levels, they're not quite at that scale, and scale of funding I think will be quite important to helping us establish that industry and the cost effectiveness of it. So sorry to jump in and add in there.
That's all right, Alana, and believe me, I'm trying from within.
Great. Well, thank you, everyone. We've reached time. Thank you so much for attending this webinar this morning. Thank you especially to our distinguished presenters, Dr. Alan Finkel, Sam Muraki, Felicity Underhill, and Alana Barlow. Thank you also to the Australia-Japan Business Cooperation Committee, and especially its CEO, Richard Andrews. We're delighted to host this event today in support of the AJBCC's annual conference. Thank you very much, everyone, and good morning.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, thank
Thanks,
you.
everyone.
Bye-bye.
Ohayou gozaimasu. Good morning.